The air above Simpson Harbor shimmers with tropical heat even as the sun descends toward the horizon. Flight Petty Officer Sato Masaru adjusts his leather flight cap and watches mechanics roll his Mitsubishi G4M, the Americans call it Betty, toward the taxiway. The bomber's aluminum skin reflects the dying light like hammered silver. Around him, 11 other aircraft prepare for departure. Their mission, a nocturnal strike against Allied shipping at Bougainville, 200 miles northwest. Sato has flown 43 combat missions. He knows the weight of darkness, the way clouds become walls of ink at altitude, the peculiar loneliness of navigation by starlight alone. But tonight feels different. Lately, fewer aircraft return from night operations. The ones that do come back shredded, their crews speaking in hushed tones about things that hunt in the dark, American machines that appear without warning, that somehow see through the night itself. He breathes in the evening air, salt from the harbor, aviation fuel, the smell of tropical vegetation rotting in the jungle beyond the airfield perimeter. In his breast pocket, folded carefully, rests a letter from his wife in Hiroshima. He has not yet opened it. There will be time for that later, he tells himself. If there is a later. By early 1944, Japan's mastery of the Pacific night had evaporated like morning mist over the islands they'd conquered with such speed 2 years earlier. The transformation wasn't gradual. It was catastrophic, measured in burning aircraft tumbling from midnight skies, in empty chairs at morning briefings, in the growing dread that settled over Japanese aircrews whenever darkness approached. American night fighters, aircraft specifically designed to hunt and kill in total darkness, had emerged from experimental curiosity into fully realized instruments of aerial warfare. For Japanese pilots trained in the traditions of Bushido, schooled in the belief that courage and skill could overcome material disadvantage, the psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical destruction. The Japanese had entered the war with significant advantages in nocturnal aviation. Their pilots possessed superior night vision training. Naval aviators, particularly, underwent rigorous adaptation regimens, restricted diets low in vitamin A to heighten sensitivity to low light, hours spent in darkened rooms before missions, specialized breathing techniques believed to enhance visual acuity. Their aircraft, though lightly built, could operate at extended ranges under the cover of darkness. The Nakajima J1N1 Gecko, Moonlight, represented Japan's own attempt at a dedicated night fighter, entering service in 1942. Japanese crews developed effective tactics, approach from below against the slightly lighter sky, use the moon to silhouette targets, strike and vanish into the protective darkness. But by 1943, they faced an enemy that had industrialized night warfare. American night fighters carried airborne intercept radar, technology that turned darkness from an ally into a trap. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow, the Navy's radar-equipped F-6F Hellcat, and the twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning, modified with AN/APG-6 radar pods, could detect Japanese aircraft from miles away, stalk them invisibly, and kill them with precision. Japanese pilots found themselves hunted by machines that violated every principle of nocturnal combat they understood. The Americans didn't need moonlight. They didn't need visual contact. They materialized from the black void with searchlights blazing, cannon fire already streaming toward vulnerable fuel tanks and bomb loads. Warrant Officer Nakamura Isamu, a veteran Betty bomber pilot, recorded his impressions after surviving an encounter over New Guinea in October 1943. His formation of 9 aircraft had departed Wewak at dusk for a raid on Port Moresby. At 1:47 hours, cruising at 11,000 feet through moonless overcast, his aircraft shuddered as tracers suddenly ripped through the starboard wing. The night erupted in flame. The Betty carried no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. In seconds, 3 bombers became meteors trailing fire into the jungle below. Nakamura's own aircraft took 17 hits before he could even identify the attacker's direction. His rear gunner never fired a shot. He'd seen nothing to shoot at. Only when the American fighter broke off, silhouetted briefly against the flames of a dying comrade, did Nakamura glimpse his killer. A twin-boom shadow, predatory, impossibly fast. He wrote in his diary, "We expected wolves in the darkness. We found demons that lived inside the darkness itself." The technology gap was absolute. American SCR-720 radar could paint a clear picture of targets up to 5 miles distant. The operator, night fighters carried dedicated radar observers, would guide the pilot through gentle verbal corrections until the target appeared on the scope's small circular screen, a luminous blip growing larger as range decreased. At 1,000 yards, skilled crews could identify aircraft type by the return signature. At 500 yards, the pilot took over, using the radar's ranging information to position himself perfectly before switching on his powerful Westinghouse searchlight. The sudden illumination, 600,000 candle power stabbing through the night, paralyzed Japanese crews for the critical seconds before. 50 caliber rounds and 20 cannon shells found their mark. Japanese pilots had trained their entire careers for visual combat. The sudden transition to technological warfare left them psychologically naked. They could not see their attackers. Their aircraft sensors consisted of human eyes, inadequate, defeated, obsolete. The courage that had carried them through daylight battles over China, through the sweeping conquests of 1941 and 1942, meant nothing against enemies that existed only as radar returns and muzzle flashes. Lieutenant Matsumoto Hiroshi, flying a Gecko night fighter on defensive patrol over Truk Lagoon in February 1944, encountered what he described as the futility of fighting ghosts. His mission was to intercept American carrier aircraft conducting nocturnal harassment raids. He'd positioned himself at 13,000 feet, scanning methodically for engine exhaust glow, for the slight darkening against stars that betrayed an aircraft's passage. Instead, his own aircraft became the hunted. Without warning, his instrument panel exploded in sparks as rounds punched through from behind and below. His observer was killed instantly. Matsumoto threw the Gecko into a violent spiral, dropping 4,000 feet in seconds. The American, he never saw it clearly, followed effortlessly, pouring fire into the Japanese fighter's vulnerable belly. Only by diving into a cloud bank, engine smoking, hydraulics failing, did Matsumoto escape. He crash-landed on Truk's reef, his aircraft a total loss. In his debriefing recorded by Naval Intelligence, Matsumoto said, "I believed darkness was neutral, that it gave equal advantage to hunter and hunted. I was wrong. The Americans have made darkness their accomplice. They see clearly while we stumble blind." How do you fight an enemy who owns the night itself? The psychological transformation was profound. Japanese aviators were trained in offensive spirit-aggressive action, closing to decisive range, trusting in skill and determination. Night fighters inverted this entire philosophy. Survival demanded evasion, defensive maneuvering, the admission that you were outmatched before combat even began. For pilots steeped in military culture that prized honor and offensive action above all else, this represented a spiritual defeat as crushing as the physical destruction. Combat reports from the Solomon Islands campaign reveal the progressive erosion of Japanese night operations. In January 1943, Japanese bombers conducted an average of 42 nocturnal sorties weekly against Guadalcanal and supporting targets. By January 1944, that number had collapsed to fewer than 8. The decline wasn't due to aircraft shortage alone. Japan's production, though inadequate, still delivered new machines. The shortage was in crews willing to fly them into night skies now ruled by radar-equipped hunters. Morale assessments noted increasing psychological casualties. Pilots reporting phantom sightings, sudden panic attacks during night flights, desperate requests for transfer to daylight units. The recurring symbol in Japanese accounts is light itself, not the natural light of sun or moon. Those were familiar, manageable, part of the traditional aviator's environment. Instead, they described the artificial light of American searchlights as something unnatural, almost supernatural. A beam that reached across miles of darkness to pin you like an insect on a board. In that light, you became utterly visible while your attacker remained shadow. Every rivet, every panel line of your aircraft suddenly outlined with perfect clarity. The searchlight represented American technological supremacy made tangible, their ability to illuminate, to know, to control what should have been hidden. Flight Petty Officer Yamada Kenji, shot down by a P-61 Black Widow near Wewak in May 1944, survived 3 days in the jungle before reaching Japanese lines. He described the moment the searchlight found him. Pure white light, brighter than noon sun, harder than steel. In that instant I understood we had already lost the war. Not because of the bullets that followed, though they were precise, devastating, but because of that light. It represented a kind of power we could never match. American industry, American science, American resources, all concentrated into one beam that turned night into day. We were fighting with swords while they wielded lightning. The tactical evolution tells a desperate story. By mid-1944, Japanese formations attempting night operations adopted increasingly extreme countermeasures. Aircraft flew at wave-top altitude, where radar returns were confused by sea clutter. Formations dispersed to maximum separation, sacrificing coordination for individual survivability. Some units experimented with crude chaff, strips of metal foil hand-thrown from aircraft to create false radar returns. Nothing worked consistently. The Americans adapted faster than Japanese tacticians could respond. Low altitude. American pilots trained in maritime interception waited patiently just above the wave caps. Dispersal. Radar allowed systematic hunting of individual targets. Chaff. New radar frequencies and skilled operators learned to distinguish real aircraft from decoys. The technological gap extended beyond radar. American night fighters carried gyrostabilized gun sights that compensated for deflection and range automatically. Their pilots flew with standardized instrument panels, redundant systems, and comprehensive training in blind flying techniques. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, relied on minimal instrumentation. Night flying remained a specialized skill requiring exceptional pilots. As losses mounted and experienced aviators died, replacement crews arrived with inadequate training, sent into combat against an enemy that had industrialized nocturnal air warfare. Perhaps most psychologically devastating, Japanese pilots could hear American night fighters on their radios. The crackling chatter of radar operators directing intercepts, calm voices coordinating kills with the detached efficiency of factory workers on an assembly line. The realization that you weren't in a battle, you were being processed, systematically eliminated by machines and men who approached killing with the same methodical competence they brought to every aspect of their war effort. There was no glory in it, no warrior's duel. You were prey being harvested. By late 1944, Japanese night flying operations had effectively ceased across much of the Pacific. The few missions attempted were one-way strikes by pilots who understood they wouldn't return. Special attack units, kamikaze, absorbed much of the remaining aviation resources. At least in a deliberate suicide dive, a pilot controlled his own death. The alternative, burning alive in darkness, shot down by an enemy you never saw, falling thousands of feet toward black ocean or jungle, held less dignity, less purpose. American intelligence officers interrogating captured Japanese aircrew were struck by the recurring theme in their testimonies. Not anger at American technological superiority, but a kind of bewildered grief. These were men who had trained for years, who had mastered their profession through discipline and dedication, only to discover their mastery meant nothing. The skills they'd honed so carefully, visual tracking, instinctive gunnery, aggressive tactics, were simply irrelevant against radar-directed interception. They had become obsolete while still living, their life's training rendered worthless by machines they couldn't understand or match. The Black Widow became a particular object of dread. With its twin-boom design, matte black paint scheme, and nickname derived from a venomous spider, it assumed almost mythological status in Japanese reports. Crews called it Black Dragon, imagining it as something supernatural rather than mechanical. This psychological displacement, transforming the enemy from technological to mystical, represented a coping mechanism for dealing with incomprehensible superiority. If the Americans possessed supernatural power, then Japanese failure could be understood as fate rather than inadequacy. The alternative, acknowledging the vast material and scientific gap, was too psychologically devastating to accept directly. The statistical reality was pitiless. By war's end, American night fighters had achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-to-1. Japanese night operations suffered casualty rates above 40% per mission, unsustainable by any military calculus. Entire bomber squadrons were effectively annihilated. The survivors carried psychological scars that, in many cases, proved permanent. Post-war interviews revealed that former night bomber crews suffered disproportionately high rates of chronic anxiety, night terrors, and what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The symbolic object that haunted these men, the searchlight beam cutting through darkness, represented something more than tactical technology. It embodied the fundamental asymmetry of the Pacific War's later stages. American abundance translated into radar sets, into thousands of hours of pilot training, into redundant systems and specialized equipment. Japanese pilots flew with courage and skill, but they flew in aircraft that represented their nation's increasingly desperate resource constraints. No amount of warrior spirit could compensate for fuel tanks that exploded when hit, for the absence of radar, for the simple reality that their enemy possessed overwhelming material superiority. What did Japanese pilots really think about American night fighters? The documentary evidence reveals not hatred or contempt, but a profound disillusionment. They had been taught that spirit transcended material, that Japanese discipline and sacrifice would overcome American decadence and mechanical dependence. Instead, they discovered that American industry had automated warfare, had removed the human element they'd trained their entire lives to master. They felt betrayed, not by their leadership exactly, but by the fundamental lie their entire military culture had perpetuated. That willpower mattered more than production capacity, that traditional warrior virtues could defeat modern industrial warfare. In the wreckage of that illusion lay a truth about 20th-century conflict that would echo far beyond the Pacific War. Wars between industrialized nations are not won by courage or sacrifice. Those exist on both sides. They are won by productive capacity, technological innovation, and the ability to translate resources into combat power faster than the enemy can adapt. The American night fighter offensive demonstrated this principle with brutal clarity. Japanese pilots were not cowards. They were not incompetent. They were simply facing an enemy that had industrialized killing with such efficiency that individual skill and bravery became tactical irrelevancies. The darkness over the Pacific in those final years of war became a metaphor for Japan's broader strategic situation. They were fighting blind against an enemy that could see their movements, their weaknesses, their inevitable defeat, with perfect clarity. The searchlight beams that pinned Japanese aircraft in the night sky represented American power made visible, overwhelming, inescapable, absolute. And in the cockpits of burning aircraft falling toward black water, Japanese pilots understood, finally, that the war had been lost long before their engines failed, before the tracers found them, before they took off into darkness. It had been lost the moment they chose to fight an enemy whose industrial capacity and technological innovation they could neither match nor counter. The night belonged to America, and in that simple fact resided the entire trajectory of the Pacific War.